The sound of it echoed off the asphalt and the concrete walls of the G-Show barracks, a sound so sharp and unexpected that it seemed to freeze time itself. One moment the world was filled with the guttural roar of senior drill instructor Vance Kruger, a man whose voice was known to strip paint and reduce grown men to stammering children. The next moment, there was only the thick, heavy silence of shock, and the sight of the most feared man on the military depot sprawled flat on his back in the red Georgia dust. Standing over him, her breathing barely elevated, was the newest member of the training cadre. Her name was Sergeant Eva Reyes, and she had just done the impossible. She had just defeated the dragon in his own den. Her simple declaration hung in the air, a calm counterpoint to the violence that had just occurred. "I'm task force," she had said, just seconds before the lunging assault that was meant to put her in her place. Now, as Kruger stared up at the sky, the shock on his face giving way to something no one had ever seen there before, a grudging, bewildered respect, the old world of the Alpha Company barracks ended and a new one began. This is the story of how that single perfect strike sent ripples through the entire military community, and how Sergeant Eva Reyes, a woman who never sought the spotlight, became a legend. The unwelcome gift. The humid Georgia air clung to Sergeant Eva Reyes's uniform like a second skin as she stepped off the bus and onto the hallowed, hated ground of the Marine Corps depot. She carried 2 duffel bags, one filled with her standard-issue gear, the other heavy with the weight of her new orders and the expectations that came with them. She was a transfer, a lateral move, in the sterile language of the Pentagon, but the reality was far more complex. Eva wasn't just any sergeant. She was a graduate of a Joint Special Operations Selection Course, a program designed to train the military's most elite warriors in inter-service cooperation and advanced tactical operations. She had the credentials, the skills, and the quiet confidence of someone who had been forged in fires that most infantrymen never even got close to. The depot, however, didn't care about her resume. It was a world of tradition, of a rigid hierarchy where respect was paid in time and sweat, not pieces of paper. As she walked toward the barracks of Alpha Company, she could feel the eyes on her. They weren't friendly, and they were assessing, calculating, and largely dismissive. To the old guard, she was an outsider, and worse, a woman stepping into the most masculine of arenas, the drill field. Staff Sergeant Morrison was the first to greet her, and his welcome was about as warm as a frostbitten handshake. He was a man carved from the same granite as the depot itself, with a neck as thick as a tree trunk, and a sneer permanently etched onto his face. "Well, well," he drawled, looking her up and down as if she were a piece of malfunctioning equipment. "The new asset has arrived. Hope they didn't break the mold making you, Reyes. This isn't some joint ops think tank. This is the real Marine Corps. We make Marines here. You think your little task force badge is going to help you when a platoon of raw recruits is about to mutiny?" Eva met his gaze without flinching. Her own eyes were a calm, steady brown, betraying no emotion. "I'm here to do a job, Staff Sergeant, just like everyone else." Morrison scoffed. "Just like everyone else? Honey, you ain't like everyone else. You're an experiment, a checkbox, and the senior drill instructor, he doesn't like experiments." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was thick with malice. "Vance Kruger, you heard of him? He eats the breakfast cereal of special sergeants like you. He's been counting the days until you arrived. He wants to see what the Pentagon's finest is really made of." He let that ominous thought hang in the air, then clapped a heavy hand on her shoulder, or steering her toward the barracks. "Come on, let's not keep the devil waiting." The barracks of Alpha Company were a living museum of Marine Corps history. The walls were lined with faded photographs of platoons past, their young faces staring out from beneath the brims of their covers, their eyes already looking 1,000 yards beyond the camera. Trophies from intercompany drills gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, each one a testament to the unit's legacy of excellence. But the most dominant feature was the atmosphere itself. It was thick with the ghosts of 1,000,000 shouted commands, 1,000,000,000 push-ups, and the unyielding pressure of a system designed to break you down to build you back up. This was Kruger's kingdom, and as Ava walked through it, she could feel the presence of the man who ruled it with an iron fist. And the air hummed with a low-grade current of fear and respect, a tangible energy that was all his own. She wasn't intimidated. She was observant. She was studying the terrain before the battle. The court of the Lion senior drill instructor Vance Kruger held court in his office, a small, cramped space that was an extension of his own personality. Stark, disciplined, and covered in the trophies of a lifetime of service. The walls were a testament to his career. There was his original Drill Instructor of the Year plaque from a decade ago, its brass finish gleaming from constant polishing. Beside it hung framed photographs of him with generals and senators, his jaw set in the same stern line in every one. But the most prominent displays were the shadow boxes, deep wooden frames containing the artifacts of his deployments. A faded Iraqi flag, a twisted piece of shrapnel from a Humvee bombing, a collection of challenge coins from units so secret their insignias were merely numbers. This was a man who had not just trained warriors. He had been one, in the most brutal arenas the modern military had to offer. When Ava was ushered in, Kruger didn't look up from the paperwork on his desk for a full 2 minutes. He let her stand at attention, letting the silence and the weight of his presence do its work. He was a bull of a man, his body thick with muscle that was starting to go to fat, but his eyes were the truly dangerous part. They were a pale, icy blue, and they held the cold, assessing gaze of a predator. Finally, he raised his head. He didn't invite her to sit. "So," he rumbled, his voice a low gravel that seemed to originate from deep in the earth. "The task force is here. I read your file? Very impressive. Schools, deployments, commendations. A real golden boy. Or girl, I should say." He leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "Let me tell you what I think of it, Sergeant Reyes. I think it's a lot of paper, a lot of theory, a lot of touchy-feely joint operations nonsense where everyone holds hands and sings Kumbaya." He stood up, moving around the desk with a surprising grace for such a large man, circling her like a shark. "Out here on my depot, we don't have time for theory. We deal in the concrete. We take scared, soft children, and we turn them into hard, mean Marines. And we do it with discipline, with fear, with tradition. We don't need some special operator coming in here to teach us new tricks. The old ones work just fine." He stopped directly in front of her. His face inches from hers. She could smell the coffee on his breath, see the tiny broken capillaries in his nose. He was trying to intimidate her, to force a flinch, a blink, anything. Ava remained a statue, her gaze fixed on a point on the wall just over his shoulder. "This is my house, Sergeant," he whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous hush. "I make the rules. I am the law. And in my house, you are nothing until I say you are something. You will observe, you will learn, and you will keep your fancy task force ideas to yourself. Do you understand me?" Ava's response was immediate, crisp, and professional. "This is Sergeant Reyes, and I understand the instructions, Senior Drill Instructor." But it was the look in her eyes that gave Kruger pause. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defiance. It was a calm, almost placid acceptance, as if she had already processed his threat, categorized it, and filed it away under irrelevant. It was the look of someone who had faced real danger, who had been shot at, and had learned that loud voices and posturing were just that, loud voices and posturing. Kruger saw that look, and it irritated him more than any sign of fear could have. This one was different. This one would require a more direct approach. The crucible of the quarterdeck. The quarterdeck of the receiving barracks was the epicenter of chaos. a vast open space of gleaming linoleum floors and echoing walls. It was here that new recruits, still in their civilian clothes and dazed from the bus ride, were introduced to the reality of Marine Corps basic training. And it was here, a few days later, that senior drill instructor Kruger decided to make his final, a public stand against Sergeant Eva Reyes. It was late afternoon, and the newest platoon of scared, confused recruits was standing on the yellow footprints, their young faces pale with anxiety. Kruger was in his element, a storm of fury and invective, his voice bouncing off the walls as he berated a trembling 18-year-old for the sin of having a stray thread on his t-shirt. The other drill instructors, including Morrison, stood at the edges, their faces masks of stern approval. This was their theater, and Kruger was the star. Ava stood apart, observing. She had spent her first days on the depot doing exactly what Kruger had ordered. Observing, learning. But what she learned wasn't what he had intended. She saw the fear in the recruit's eyes, yes, but she also saw the confusion. Kruger's method was pure psychological warfare, a bludgeon to smash away individuality. It was effective in its way, she knew. It produced Marines who could follow orders under extreme stress. But she also saw the ones it broke, the ones whose spirits were crushed so completely that no amount of rebuilding could resurrect them. She saw the inefficiency of it, the blunt instrument approach where a scalpel might do. Kruger spotted her watching. It was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He left the terrified recruit and stalked across the quarterdeck, his boots striking the floor like hammer blows. The entire space fell silent. Every recruit, every junior drill instructor, every staff member in the vicinity turned to watch. The air crackled with anticipation. He stopped in front of her, hands on his hips, chest puffed out. He didn't speak to her, but to the room at large. His voice a theatrical boom. Look at this. We have a visitor, gentlemen, a special one. Sergeant Reyes here is from Task Force. That's right. She's been to all the fancy schools. She knows 100 ways to kill a man with a paperclip, I'm sure. He turned to her, his icy eyes glittering with malice. So I have to ask myself, what is someone so highly trained doing on my depot? Why aren't you out in the field, conducting your secret missions? He leaned closer, his voice dropping back to that intimate, dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. Or maybe, he said slowly, deliberately, the task force isn't all it's cracked up to be. Maybe it's just a place for people who couldn't cut it in the real forces. A place for diversity quotas and political correctness. A place for our special treatment. The insult landed. It was a direct hit on her honor, her unit, and everything she had worked for. It was a public challenge that, by the unwritten code of the depot, demanded a response. The silence became absolute. Everyone held their breath. Ava slowly turned her head, her calm brown eyes finally meeting his pale blue ones. There was no anger in her gaze, no heat, just a deep, profound certainty. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was clear as a bell, cutting through the tension like a blade. I'm Task Force, she declared. It wasn't a boast, it wasn't a defense. It was a simple, irrefutable statement of fact. It was the calm before the storm. And in that moment, Vance Kruger knew that his verbal jabs had failed. He had drawn his line in the sand, and she had not only refused to step back, but she had stepped forward and erased it with her foot. Something in him snapped. The controlled fury of the senior drill instructor gave way to something more primal, more personal. His face contorted, a vein bulging in his forehead. Without a word of warning, he lunged. The geometry of a single moment. It happened so fast that most of the onlookers only registered the beginning and the end. But to those with trained eyes, those who understood the physics of violence, what occurred in the space between the lunge and the fall was a thing of terrible, perfect beauty. Kruger was a big man, and he used his size as a weapon. He came in low and fast, his arms outstretched, intending to grab her, to use his immense weight to drive her backward, to slam her against the wall and humiliate her physically. To prove, once and for all, the superiority of brute force over fancy training. Ava saw it coming a mile away. To her, his telegraphing was obvious. The way he loaded his weight onto his back foot, the slight drop of his shoulders, the flare of his nostrils. It was all a prelude she had been trained to read in countless sparring sessions against bigger, stronger opponents. She didn't back up. Backing up would give him momentum. Instead, she did the one thing he never expected. She stepped forward. It was a tiny step, a subtle adjustment of her left foot, angling her body just slightly off his line of attack. In that micro moment, as his hands clawed at the air where she had just been, she became the axis around which his entire world would turn. Her right hand, the one she used for writing reports and saluting superiors, I transformed into a weapon. It wasn't a wild haymaker or a desperate flail. It was a precise, economical movement, a perfectly executed palm-heel strike. Her hand traveled in a short, devastating arc, the heel of her palm connecting not with his chest or his face, but with the exact center of his chin. It was the perfect target. The chin is a lever connected to the skull, and a sharp blow there transmits force directly to the vestibular system in the inner ear, the body's gyroscope. A strike to the chin doesn't just hurt, it literally shuts down the brain's ability to maintain balance. The sound it made wasn't a wet smack or a bone-breaking crunch. It was a sharp, clean pop, like a single round fired from a pistol. It was the sound of absolute force, meeting absolute resistance and winning. Kruger's forward momentum didn't stop, but its purpose was horrifically inverted. His legs, suddenly disconnected from his brain's commands, continued their charge, but his upper body went limp. He performed a strange, almost graceful pirouette in midair, his body rotating 180 degrees on its axis. For a split second, he was facing the direction he had come from, his eyes wide with a look of pure, uncomprehending shock. Then, like a felled oak, he collapsed backward. He didn't stumble or fall to his knees. He went straight down, his body stiff as a board, and hit the linoleum floor with a sickening, ground-shaking thud that echoed through the silent quarterdeck. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. The only sound was the slow, heavy creak of Kruger's leather duty belt as he lay there, staring unseeing at the ceiling, completely and utterly unconscious. When the lion of the depot was down, Ava stood over him, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged. She looked at him not with triumph, but with a clinical detachment, as if she were a doctor observing a patient. She glanced at her right hand, flexing the fingers, then returned her gaze to the fallen senior drill instructor. In the deafening silence, her voice was soft, almost gentle. He's going to have a hell of a headache when he wakes up. Shockwaves in the red dirt. The silence that followed Ava's statement was more powerful than any sound. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, of a reality shifting on its axis. Then the whispers started. They began as a low murmur among the recruits, a rustle of disbelief that quickly grew into a wave of hushed, awestruck chatter. On Staff Sergeant Morrison's face was a mask of horror and confusion, his sneer long gone, replaced by the slack-jawed look of a man watching his entire belief system crumble before his eyes. He looked from the crumpled form of his mentor to the calm, composed figure of Sergeant Reyes, and he couldn't process what he was seeing. Kruger groaned, a deep, guttural sound of returning consciousness. He stirred, trying to push himself up, but his arms were like rubber. Two junior drill instructors rushed forward, not to apprehend Eva, but to help their fallen leader. They gently rolled him onto his back. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. He looked up at the ceiling, then his gaze drifted to the faces peering down at him, and finally, it landed on Eva. She hadn't moved. She stood a respectful distance away, watching with that same unnerving calm. For a moment, the old fire flickered in his eyes, the instinct to rage, to reassert dominance. But as he tried to speak, a wave of nausea washed over him, and the world tilted violently. He saw her, standing there, and the image was superimposed with the memory of that split second before impact, the look of absolute certainty in her eyes. He had lunged at 100 Marines in his career, and 100 Marines had flinched. She hadn't. She had moved into him, had taken him apart with less effort than it took to swat a fly. The rage was replaced by something else, something he hadn't felt in decades, genuine, unnerving humility. Medical corpsmen arrived, called by a panicked clerk. They carefully loaded Kruger onto a stretcher. As they lifted him, his eyes met Ava's one last time, and there was no threat in them, no malice. There was only a deep, searching question, as if he was looking at her and seeing an entirely new type of human being. He didn't speak as they carried him out. He didn't have the words. The moment the doors closed behind the stretcher, the quarterdeck exploded. The rigid discipline shattered. Recruits, forgetting their fear, turned to each other with wide eyes and excited whispers. "Did you see that? She dropped him with one hit. Who is she?" The other drill instructors stood in a stunned circle. Their authority momentarily evaporated. Morrison just kept shaking his head, muttering, "I don't believe it. I don't believe it." Eva ignored the chaos. She walked over to a water fountain, took a long, slow drink, and then calmly walked back to her position. A young and terrified recruit standing nearby was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. She stopped, looked at him, and gave him the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a smile, but it was an acknowledgement. It said, "You're okay. Breathe." In that simple gesture, she had done more to calm him than an hour of Kruger's screaming could have. A new kind of authority. The investigation was swift and, to the surprise of many, painless. The quarterdeck was covered by multiple security cameras, and the footage told a story that needed no interpretation. It showed Kruger approaching Reyes, verbally taunting her, and then physically lunging at her without provocation. It showed her acting purely in self-defense, her single strike a textbook example of controlled, proportional force. The base commander, in a woman who had known Kruger for years and had grown weary of his methods, reviewed the tape and closed the case within 24 hours. Sergeant Eva Reyes was cleared of any and all wrongdoing. Kruger was in the hospital for 2 days with a severe concussion. When he was released, he was given a choice by the command: a medical retirement with full honors or a transfer to a training battalion on the other side of the country, far from the depot. He chose retirement. His kingdom was gone. The myth of his invincibility had been shattered in a single public moment, and he knew he could never rule in the same way again. His departure left a vacuum, a void in the power structure of Alpha Company. Everyone assumed the command would bring in another grizzled veteran to fill Kruger's shoes. But a week later, a new set of orders was posted. The new senior drill instructor of Alpha Company was Sergeant Eva Reyes. The announcement was met with a stunned silence that quickly gave way to a different kind of energy. The other drill instructors, led by a humbled Staff Sergeant Morrison, were the first to adapt. Morrison, who had once dismissed her as a checkbox, was now her most fervent supporter. He had seen what she was capable of, and more importantly, he had seen the way she handled herself afterward. There was no gloating, no triumph, just quiet competence. Under Ava's leadership, Alpha Company began to change. The change was subtle at first. The screaming didn't entirely stop, but it became less frequent, more purposeful. She introduced new training modules based on her special operations experience, focusing on small unit decision-making and mental resilience. And not just blind obedience. She treated the recruits like the future Marines they were, not like raw materials to be broken down. The results were immediate and dramatic. The platoon's performance scores on drills and exercises skyrocketed. The number of recruits who washed out, who were sent home for failing to adapt, plummeted. Years later, a retired master sergeant would tell the story to a group of new drill instructor candidates. He would describe the sound of the strike, the image of the invincible Kruger lying on the floor. "But that's not why you should remember Sergeant Reyes," he'd say, leaning forward. "You should remember her because she didn't just beat the toughest man on the depot. She beat his system. She showed us that you can build a Marine with a steady hand as well as an iron fist. She didn't just win a fight. She changed how we think." And somewhere, in a quiet town in the Midwest, a young woman who had been that terrified recruit on the quarterdeck that day would be putting on her own drill instructor's cover for the first time. She would look in the mirror, and she wouldn't see Kruger's reflection. She would see the calm, steady eyes of Sergeant Ava Reyes, and she would remember the lesson that was taught without a single shout. That true authority isn't about the volume of your voice, but the certainty of your action. And she would go out to greet her own new platoon, ready to build them up, not tear them down.